The desert stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun, a sea of sand and stone that shimmered like glass. The air was heavy, dry enough to steal the breath from a dying throat. Buzzards circled high above, tracing slow, patient loops in the sky. They knew death when it came wandering through their territory, and on this day, death seemed certain for the young woman lying motionless beside a cracked boulder. Her name was Ayana. The once proud daughter of a mountain tribe now lay broken and alone, her skin streaked with dust and blood, her body bearing the marks of betrayal. Her tribe, her own people, had left her here to die. Branded a traitor for loving a man from beyond their borders, she had been judged beneath the old oak to the chanting of the elders. Her pleas were met with silence. When dawn came, she was cast into the wasteland with nothing but the clothes on her back and the ache in her chest. The vultures grew bolder as the day dragged on. One swooped lower, its wings slicing the heat, but she stirred, barely, a faint twitch of her fingers. She wasn't dead yet. The spirit that had carried her through nights of hardship still flickered inside her. But each breath was a battle, each blink another moment stolen from the inevitable. Miles away, another soul wandered the desert, though for far different reasons. His name was Colt Maddox, an outlaw with a price on his head, and a past that clung to him like a shadow. He had ridden through the canyons at sunrise, escaping the gun smoke of his latest robbery. He was the kind of man who didn't look back. His sins were too many and his heart too tired. Yet something in the wind that day, a whisper, a feeling, drew him off his path. By dusk, his horse trudged over the ridge and stopped suddenly. Colt squinted against the glare. Something, or someone, lay ahead. At first, he thought it was another lost traveler, but as he drew closer, he saw the truth. It was a woman, barely breathing, her dark hair tangled with sand, her face sunburned and ghostly pale. The marks on her wrists told him she'd been bound. The blood on her side told him she'd been left for dead. He dismounted and knelt beside her, brushing the sand from her face. Her lips were cracked, her breath faint but there. He looked around. No footprints but hers, fading into the horizon. No tribe, no camp, no mercy. Only her and the endless desert. For a long moment Colt hesitated. He wasn't a savior, he never had been. He'd ridden past plenty of dying men before, never once stopping. But this woman, something in her stillness, in the quiet defiance of her heartbeat, made him pause. Maybe it was her spirit. Maybe it was guilt gnawing at him from a past he couldn't bury. Or maybe, deep down, he saw in her what he had long lost in himself. Someone worth saving. He lifted her gently, carrying her to his horse. Her body was limp, light as air, and he felt the fragility of her life in his arms. The sky burned orange as the sun sank behind the mountains, and Colt rode toward the nearest canyon. A place he knew well, a place the law rarely followed. Night came fast. The temperature dropped, and the desert turned cruel once more. Colt made a small fire, laying the woman near it. He poured a few drops of water on her lips, careful not to waste it. She stirred weakly, her hand twitching in the dust. He watched her, silent, the flames reflecting in his tired eyes. As the stars spread like frost across the sky, Colt leaned back against the rock wall. He didn't know who she was or what story had brought her here. But he knew fate had a strange way of finding him, in the loneliest places. He had spent his life outrunning the world, yet now he found himself standing still, beside a stranger who clung to life with the same stubborn will that once burned in him. The night deepened. Coyotes howled in the distance. Colt pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders, watching the rise and fall of her chest. He didn't pray often, but tonight, he did. Not for forgiveness, not for himself, but for the stranger fate had thrown in his path. And somewhere in the dark silence of the canyon, the first thread of their story began to weave itself into the wind. A story born from betrayal, fire, and the faint heartbeat of a woman the world had already forgotten. When dawn would rise again over the red horizon, nothing would ever be the same. The first light of dawn crept over the canyons, painting the jagged cliffs in gold and amber. The world was still except for the faint crackle of the dying fire and the slow, ragged breath of the woman lying beneath Colt Maddox's weathered coat. Ayanna's eyes fluttered open, blinking against the harsh light that spilled over her face. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The last thing she remembered was the cruel laughter of her tribe, the desert swallowing her footsteps, and the feeling of her heart breaking as her strength failed. Now, she found herself sheltered beneath a rock ledge, wrapped in warmth that wasn't her own. Her body ached, her throat burned, and her wounds pulsed with pain. But she was alive. Somehow, against all odds, life had clung to her. Colt stirred nearby, his hand resting near his revolver even in sleep. The faint lines on his face caught the morning sun. Scars of old battles, both fought and fled. His hat lay tipped over his eyes, and his chest rose and fell with the slow rhythm of a man too long on the run. Ayanna studied him quietly, unsure if he was a dream or a threat. There was something rough and dangerous about him, but something else too. An unspoken heaviness, a kind of tired kindness buried beneath the grit. Colt awoke not long after, and though words were not exchanged, understanding passed between them in silence. He brought her water, tearing a strip from his own shirt to clean her wounds. She winced but didn't pull away. He worked with the steadiness of a man who'd patched up far too many wounds in his life. His own, and those of others who didn't live long enough to thank him. For days they remained hidden in the canyon. Colt hunted small game and fetched water from a narrow stream that wound through the rocks. The sun scorched the days, and the cold cut through the nights, but under the outlaw's care, Ayanna's strength began to return. She still said nothing. Her eyes told stories instead, of betrayal, loss, and a deep, haunting sorrow that words could never hold. Colt didn't press her. He wasn't a man who needed explanations. The world had taught him that silence carried its own truths. He only knew she had been left to die, and that was reason enough to keep her alive. One evening, as the sky bled into crimson and purple, Colt sat by the fire sharpening his knife, while Ayanna traced lines in the sand with her fingers. Around them, the canyon breathed softly. The sound of wind through stone, the whisper of distant creatures moving in the dark. Colt's mind wandered back to the bounty posters with his face on them, nailed to tavern walls across the frontier. He wondered if any lawman would dare chase him this deep into the desert. Few ever did. The land itself was a kind of judge, ruthless, fair, and final. He thought of leaving her once she was strong enough to stand. It would be the smart thing to do. He had a long trail of enemies and a future that didn't stretch far. But each day he found it harder to imagine riding away. There was something in her presence, a quiet resilience, a dignity untouched by cruelty, that reminded him of what the world had once been before greed and blood turned it hollow. Ayanna, though still weak, began to move about the camp. She gathered dry twigs, tended the small fire, and sometimes watched Colt as he cleaned his rifle or mended the saddle straps. The silence between them was not empty. It was a fragile bridge slowly forming, one unspoken moment at a time. But peace, in the Wild West, was never meant to last. One afternoon, as Colt returned from scouting the nearby ridge, he spotted smoke rising from the east. The thin, dark column twisted up into the sky like a warning. It wasn't natural smoke. It was too controlled, too sharp. Campfire smoke. He crouched low, scanning the horizon. In the far distance, the faint movement of horses shimmered against the heat. He knew what it meant. Someone was coming. He returned to the canyon with urgency in his step. Ayanna saw the change in his eyes before he even spoke. He packed quickly, tossing supplies into his saddlebag, kicking dirt over the fire. She watched him, confusion and fear mingling in her gaze. Though he hadn't said a word, she understood. They were no longer safe here. Colt glanced at her, motioning toward the horse. She hesitated for only a moment before obeying. Trust wasn't something she gave easily, but she knew death when it came stalking. Whoever hunted out here wasn't likely to show mercy to her or to the man who had saved her. By the time the riders reached the edge of the canyon, Colt and Ayanna were already miles away, riding through the maze of red stone and shadow. The hoofbeats echoed against the cliffs, fading into the roar of the wind. Dust rose behind them like a ghost, swallowing their tracks. As the sun began to set, they crossed into a stretch of wilderness few dared to enter, an old mining valley long abandoned after a cave-in had buried half the men who worked there. The broken structures still stood like skeletons of a forgotten past, their timbers creaking in the wind. Colt led them into one of the old shacks near the base of the hill. It would serve as shelter, at least for the night. Ayanna sank to the ground, exhausted. Colt stood by the doorway, peering into the distance, watching for movement. He could feel it. The storm that always followed him. Trouble never needed a reason, it only needed a scent. Inside, the air smelled of dust and rusted iron. The last light of day fell through a crack in the wall, painting Ayanna's face in gold. Colt turned slightly, catching sight of her there. Worn, fragile, but alive. A strange feeling stirred in his chest, one he hadn't felt in years. It was dangerous, that feeling. Dangerous because it made him care. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly beyond the horizon. The wind carried a chill now, sweeping through the ruins like a whisper of the dead. The outlaws' refuge had kept them safe for now, but both of them knew this was only the calm before something far greater. The desert had spared her once, and fate had tied her life to his. But in the Wild West, fate always demanded a price. And as night closed in around the shattered mining town, Colt Maddox realized that saving her life might have just cost him his own. The storm that night never broke, but the air carried its promise, thick, heavy, and waiting. The valley lay in restless silence beneath a bruised sky, and the old mining camp seemed to breathe with ghosts. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind through the broken beams, spoke of the men who had once toiled and died there. In the heart of that ruin, Ayanna slept fitfully beside the remnants of a small fire, her fragile body wrapped in Colt Maddox's coat. The outlaw himself remained awake, leaning against the warped doorway with his revolver resting across his lap. He could feel it. The eyes of the world closing in again. He had lived long enough to recognize when fate was about to turn against him. The smoke he'd seen earlier that day wasn't just from travelers. It was from trackers. Hunters who rode without mercy, and who knew how to follow the faintest of trails. Whether they were after him or the woman, Colt didn't yet know. But he could sense the storm of blood that was coming. The wind shifted, carrying with it a distant sound, hooves. Slow at first, faint as a heartbeat, but growing. Colt's jaw tightened. He stepped outside, scanning the horizon. In the dim light, the ridges beyond the mine flickered with movement. Dark shapes against darker stone. He counted 4 riders, maybe 5, experienced, spread wide. They were sweeping the valley like wolves closing in on wounded prey. Inside the shack, Ayanna stirred. Some old instinct, born from years of surviving her tribe's hunts, told her danger was near. Her body still weak, she sat up, eyes searching for Colt's silhouette against the firelight. He was already gone, moving through the shadows, silent as a ghost. Colt led his horse out from the rear of the mine and began covering their tracks. He scattered loose dirt over the prints, brushed away the signs of the fire, and led the animal deeper into the canyon behind the camp. His mind worked with precision born of desperation. The woman couldn't ride far yet, and if they stayed here, they'd be trapped. He needed another way out, one the hunters wouldn't expect. Through the narrow canyon path, Colt found what he was looking for. A collapsed mine shaft, half hidden by rubble and dust. The old wooden beams had rotted, but the tunnel beyond still held. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to hide her until the riders passed. He returned quickly, found Ayanna awake and watching him. Without a word, he lifted her gently to her feet. Her legs trembled beneath her weight, but she clung to him, drawing strength from his steadiness. He led her through the darkness, through the winding path of stone, until the narrow mouth of the mine swallowed them both. The darkness was absolute. Only the faint glow of Colt's lantern lit the rough walls. The air was thick with dust and the smell of rusted iron. They moved deeper inside until even the sound of the wind faded. There, in the shadows, they waited. Hours passed like years. Outside, the sound of hooves grew louder, then stopped. Voices carried through the stillness, low, harsh, and certain. The hunters had arrived. Colt listened, unmoving, his hand never leaving the revolver at his side. Through the cracks in the rocks, faint light flickered. Torches. The riders were close enough to see the tracks he had tried to erase. One of them dismounted, walking the ground, studying the dirt. Colt could tell by the sound of the man's boots. This was someone who knew how to track. The kind who could read a single broken twig and tell a story from it. The kind Colt himself had once been. The tracker called out to the others, his voice sharp. The horses shuffled. Then came silence again, the kind that tightens the air and squeezes the breath from your chest. Colt's pulse stayed steady, but his eyes flicked to Ayanna. She sat motionless, her hand pressed against her mouth to stifle even the sound of breathing. Minutes crawled by. Then, at last, the riders began to move on, their torches bobbing away into the distance. Their voices grew faint, swallowed by the night. Colt didn't move for a long time, waiting until the last echo of hooves had vanished beyond the valley walls. When he finally stepped outside, dawn was breaking again. A pale, fragile light spilling over the desert like spilled milk. The sky glowed red along the horizon, the color of warning. Ayanna followed, her body weak but her eyes steady. Together they watched the world wake once more, knowing that what had hunted them tonight would not stop. Colt knew their luck had only just begun to run thin. Those men weren't ordinary bounty chasers. He'd seen the way they moved, disciplined, precise. They were too careful to be mere lawmen. There was something else behind them, something older, something that moved with a purpose more personal than money. As they prepared to ride again, Colt glanced at Ayanna. The wind tugged at her dark hair, carrying the faint scent of dust and sage. She looked back at him, and though no words passed between them, the truth was clear. They were bound now, not by choice, but by survival. They rode hard that day, through the shifting dunes and the narrow trails that cut through the red rock. The land grew harsher, the air drier, and the heat rose from the earth, like breath from a beast. The farther they went, the more the land seemed to close in, like the desert itself was testing their will to live. As night fell again, they found shelter in a hollowed-out cave high above the valley floor. From there, Colt could see miles of empty country. No riders, no smoke. For the first time in days, they were truly alone. Ayanna collapsed near the fire, her exhaustion overtaking her. Colt sat nearby, staring into the flames. The memory of those riders gnawed at him. He knew men like that. They didn't quit. They followed until there was nothing left to find. He thought again of the marks on Ayanna's wrists, the faint scars that spoke of bindings, of punishment. He didn't know what sin her people had accused her of, but he knew this someone still wanted her gone. The fire crackled softly, and the stars blinked coldly above. Colt's eyes lingered on her once more. Somewhere along this road, she had stopped being just another stranger to save. He had carried her out of the desert once, but now, he wasn't sure which of them was saving the other. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying a faint, familiar sound. Distant hoofbeats, like a whisper from the darkness. The hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. The cave lay hidden high among the red cliffs, a lonely perch overlooking the endless sweep of the desert. Morning sunlight filtered through its narrow mouth, falling softly on the figures within. Colt Maddox sat near the entrance, his rifle resting across his knees, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the riders who had haunted their trail. The outlaw's instincts had kept them alive so far, but even he knew that time was closing in around them. Behind him, Ayanna slept fitfully. Her dreams were not kind. They carried her back to the night her world ended. The night her tribe turned against her. She saw again the faces of those she had trusted, their eyes filled with cold judgment as they bound her hands and dragged her into the desert. She remembered the firelight, the chants of her people, and the voice of her mother, trembling yet silent. She had been accused of breaking the sacred law, loving an outsider, a man who had once come to their lands in search of trade, but left with more than he'd bargained for her heart. The punishment had been exile. Death by desert. Her crime, they said, was betrayal. But in the unforgiving wild, the line between love and treachery had never been clear. When Ayanna awoke, the light had shifted. The air inside the cave was cool, and the faint scent of smoke lingered from the small fire Colt had built. She sat up slowly, her body still frail but stronger than before. Colt turned his head slightly, watching her without speaking. For days, they had existed in quiet rhythm, his vigilance, her recovery. But in that silence, something unspoken had begun to grow. Ayanna's eyes followed the distant horizon, where the desert stretched endlessly. She knew they couldn't keep running forever. Her people had ways of tracking that no outsider could understand. Signs in the wind, whispers in the dust. If they wanted her dead, they would find her. And the men who chased Colt, they were another danger entirely. Two storms gathering toward one center. Colt stood and moved to his horse, checking the saddle and the rifle strapped to its side. He had spent most of his life in motion, always running, always fighting. But now, for the first time, he hesitated. Every instinct told him to keep going alone. Yet, something inside him had shifted the day he found her. She had been dying, abandoned by her own blood, but her will to live had shown stronger than his own. It stirred something in him, something he thought long dead. That afternoon, they left the cave behind and followed the canyon trail north. The land grew wilder, the cliffs taller, the shadows deeper. Old ruins dotted the landscape, remnants of settlements swallowed by sand. The path twisted through stone arches and dry riverbeds, the kind of places where both the hunted and the hunters disappeared forever. As they rode, Colt noticed the marks on her wrists more clearly now. The faint scars where the ropes had bitten deep. But beneath the dust and exhaustion, he saw another mark. A small symbol inked faintly on her shoulder, half hidden beneath the torn fabric of her dress. It wasn't tribal. It was older, more deliberate. That mark told a story. As the sun dipped low and they set camp near a dried-up creek, Colt studied it quietly from a distance. He'd seen something like it once before, years ago, in a border town where whispers spoke of an ancient tribe that guarded a secret relic of immense power, said to grant control over life and death itself. Men had killed for that rumor. Empires had burned for it. And now, it seemed, that same mark was carved into the skin of the woman he had saved. Night fell heavy, bringing with it the cold breath of the desert. The fire crackled low, throwing long shadows across the sand. Ayanna sat near it, tracing patterns in the dirt, lost in thought. Her eyes reflected the flames, deep and unreadable. Colt leaned back against a rock, the unease in his chest growing. He realized then that the men chasing them might not be after him alone. They might be after her. The riders they had evaded weren't bounty hunters. They had moved too precisely, too silently. They hadn't called out, hadn't fired warning shots. They were searching for something specific, something they couldn't risk damaging. Ayanna. As the hours passed, the wind picked up, howling through the canyons like an old spirit. Colt tossed sand over the fire and stood watch again, his mind churning. He didn't know what kind of past this woman carried, or what secret she might be hiding. But he could feel it. Whatever it was older than both of them, and deadly enough to bring armies to ruin. When dawn came, They continued north, following the dry creek until it opened into a wide plateau. The air shimmered with heat, and far in the distance, a dark line of trees marked the edge of an oasis, rare, hidden, and sacred. Ayana's gaze locked on it, her breath catching. She knew that place. It was a forbidden ground once spoken of in her tribe's stories. A sanctuary for the forsaken. A place where the condemned sought forgiveness from the spirits. But as they neared, something was wrong. Smoke rose from the trees, thin and black against the pale sky. The oasis was burning. Colt slowed his horse, hand drifting to his revolver. The scent of fire carried through the wind, mixed with another. Blood. They dismounted at the edge of the clearing. Bodies lay among the reeds. Warriors from Ayana's tribe, their faces painted for war, their spears broken, their arrows spent. Whatever had happened here had been fast and brutal. Ayana's steps faltered as she knelt beside one of them, her expression hollow. These were her people, the same ones who had left her to die. Yet even now, seeing their stillness, she felt no vengeance. Only sorrow. Colt's eyes moved across the ground. Tracks, fresh ones, led away from the oasis into the northern pass, horse tracks. Heavy, organized. The same riders who had hunted them. He turned toward her, his gaze hardening with realization. Whoever wanted her gone wasn't just chasing them anymore. They were wiping out anyone connected to her. The desert had turned into a battlefield, and she was at its heart. The wind shifted again, carrying ashes across the sand. The fire behind them crackled low, consuming the remains of the oasis. Ayana stood slowly, the smoke curling around her like a shroud. Something in her eyes changed then. Not fear, not grief, but resolve. Colt saw it too. Whatever had been hidden within her had now awakened. And in that moment, both of them knew. Their fates were no longer just bound by chance. They were bound by something far greater. Something that neither of them could yet name. As they turned toward the northern trail, the sun dipped behind the cliffs, and the desert fell once more into shadow. Somewhere in that darkness, the hunters moved closer, their torches glowing like eyes in the night. The secret beneath Ayana's skin had begun to reveal itself, and it would soon decide who lived and who burned. The desert had never been kind, but now it seemed almost alive, breathing, watching, waiting. Colt Maddox and Ayana rode through its vast emptiness, the red horizon stretching endlessly before them. Behind them, the smoke of the burned oasis still curled faintly into the morning sky, a black scar against the gold of dawn. Neither looked back. There was nothing left to return to, only the weight of what they had seen, and the knowledge that the storm was closing in. The trail north cut through a land of jagged rocks and narrow passes. It was a place few dared to travel. Old bones of cattle and men alike lay bleached in the sun, a warning from the desert itself. The air shimmered with heat, and every sound seemed sharper. The wind scraping against stone, the slow clop of hooves, the faint jingle of Colt's gear. Yet beneath that harsh rhythm was a silence far heavier. It was the kind that carried questions neither of them could voice. Colt had spent much of his life running from ghosts, lawmen, debts, and sins. But none had felt quite like this. The mark on Ayana's skin haunted his thoughts. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a story carved in blood. He had seen something like it once before, years ago, when a dying prospector whispered of a relic buried deep within native lands. A talisman said to hold the power of life and death. The mark, he'd said, belonged to its guardian, a bloodline chosen to protect it for generations. Now that same mark rested on the shoulder of the woman he'd saved. And the men who hunted her weren't bounty chasers. They were seeking something ancient, something sacred. As the day burned on, Ayana's strength began to fade again. Her wounds had healed, but exhaustion clung to her like a shadow. Colt called a halt near a cluster of stones shaped by time and wind into strange, twisted figures. He led the horse under their shade and let her rest. The world around them was utterly still. The wind had died, and even the desert birds had gone silent. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the skin, heavy and expectant. Colt scanned the ridges above, his instincts prickling. They were being watched. Far off, a glint caught his eye, a reflection of sun on metal. Then another. Colt's grip tightened on his revolver. They weren't alone. Within moments, the quiet shattered. Gunfire cracked through the canyon, bullets splintering rock. The horse reared, screaming. Colt grabbed Ayanna, pulling her behind the stone formation as dust exploded around them. The air filled with the stench of gunpowder and grit. He fired back once, twice, measured, calm, each shot finding its echo across the cliffs. The riders had found them. There were 6 this time. Faces masked with cloth, their movements sharp and disciplined. They rode in formation, cutting through the canyon with purpose. Colt knew that pattern. These weren't random mercenaries, this was a kill squad. Hired men who didn't stop until their target stopped breathing. The fight raged for minutes that felt like hours. Colt moved like the gunslinger he'd been born to be. Ruthless, precise, unflinching. But no man could outshoot the world forever. One bullet grazed his arm. Another tore into his side. Blood bloomed through his shirt, hot and dark. Still, he didn't falter. Ayanna crouched beside him, her heart pounding like thunder. Something inside her shifted then. A pulse, deep and strange, echoing through her chest. The mark on her shoulder seemed to burn faintly, the ink glowing as if lit from beneath her skin. She pressed her palm against it, feeling the warmth spread through her veins. For a brief moment, she saw flashes, visions of fire and smoke, of ancient rituals beneath starlit skies, of warriors bowing before a stone altar. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew it came from the blood she carried, the curse or gift of her lineage. Her people had guarded something powerful, something terrible, and that power was now waking within her. When Colt's strength began to fade, she moved to shield him, her hand trembling as she touched the wound at his side. The warmth from her mark spread into him, steady and strange. His breathing slowed, the bleeding easing as though time itself hesitated. He stared at her, pale but conscious, not knowing what to make of what he felt. The last of the riders approached, reloading his rifle as he came around the stone. Colt raised his revolver weakly, but before he could fire, the wind itself seemed to shift. Ayanna's eyes darkened, and the air around her shimmered like heat rising from a flame. The rider's horse screamed, rearing violently, throwing its rider into the dust. When Colt blinked again, the man lay still, his body twisted, lifeless. The canyon fell silent once more. The battle was over. Only the wind returned, whispering through the rocks as if nothing had happened. Colt leaned back against the stone, breathing hard, staring at Ayanna with disbelief and something deeper. Something that felt like fear. She turned away from him, clutching her arm, where the mark still glowed faintly before fading to its usual shade. The power that had surged through her, now, left her hollow, trembling, as if she had given a part of herself to stop death's hand. They buried the bodies before nightfall, piling stones over them as the desert sky turned to gold and violet. The air smelled of dust and iron. Ayanna stood silently, her eyes tracing the horizon where the sun sank into shadow. She knew the men who came today were only the beginning. Whoever commanded them would not stop, not until the secret within her was either taken or destroyed. Colt bound his wound and tried to keep his voice steady, but something had changed between them. The outlaw who had once saved her life now found himself bound to her fate. He had seen too much to walk away, and though he couldn't explain what he'd witnessed, he knew this much: whatever power slept inside-eyed Ayanna was something the world had no business touching. Night fell cold and fast. They built a small fire and sat in silence, the stars like shards of ice above them. The wind carried the faint echo of distant drums, so far away they could have been memory or prophecy. Colt knew what it meant. The hunt was far from over, and Ayanna knew something even darker, that the secret of her blood was no longer dormant. The desert had awakened it. As the flames flickered low, casting their faces in amber light, the outlaw and the forsaken woman sat together in the quiet aftermath of blood. The road ahead stretched endless, but both knew now there would be no turning back. Because the power she carried was no longer hidden, and soon, the entire frontier would come searching for it. The dawn came slow and heavy, bleeding across the desert in hues of copper and crimson. Ayanna woke to the sound of wind whispering over the sands, carrying with it the scent of ash and the echo of faraway thunder. The night had been long and silent, haunted by memories, visions, and the weight of things left unsaid. Beside her, Colt Maddox still slept, his face pale beneath the fading embers of their campfire. The wound in his side had closed, but the strength had not yet returned to him. Ayanna rose quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon. The desert stretched endless before her, but far to the east, she could see the faint shimmer of movement. Dust rising from hooves, a small army cutting across the land like a storm. They were cunning. Not for vengeance, but for the power that lived within her. The power that had already begun to awaken. She knew then what she had to do. The outlaw had saved her life, but now his was bound to hers, tangled in something neither could escape. And if he stayed by her side, he would die for a cause that was never his. She turned to him, her heart heavy. He had become her shelter in a world that had cast her aside, but even love, silent and unspoken, could not stop what was coming. Colt stirred, his hand resting instinctively on the revolver beside him. His eyes opened slowly, meeting hers. For a long moment, neither moved. The wind hissed low through the canyon, rustling the dry grass. Then he saw the look in her eyes, the kind of look that carried goodbye inside it, and he knew. They packed what little they had. Colt's movements were slow but sure, every gesture deliberate. He'd been in fights before, seen death up close, but something about this morning felt different. The air carried a charge, like lightning waiting to strike. They rode north, following a narrow trail between ridges of red stone. The world around them was silent, except for the creak of saddle leather and the rhythmic clop of hooves. Time stretched thin, fragile. As the sun rose higher, Colt felt the pull of fatigue in his body, but he ignored it. He kept his eyes on Ayanna riding ahead of him, her figure framed by the burning sky. There was something about her that seemed otherworldly now, strong, resolute, almost untouchable. The same woman he'd found broken and left for dead was now a force the desert itself seemed to bow before. By midday, they reached the ruins of an old mission. Its stone walls stood half buried in sand, its cross long fallen. It was a place forgotten by men, yet somehow it felt alive. The air there was different, thick, humming, charged with a strange energy. Ayanna dismounted slowly, her eyes drawn to the center of the courtyard, where a circle of ancient symbols was carved into the earth. She knelt before it, tracing the worn markings with her fingers. The designs were the same as those burned into her skin. The mark of her lineage, the bloodline of the guardian. This was where it had begun. This was where it had to end. Colt approached, his boots crunching softly against the sand. He didn't need words to understand what she intended. The look in her eyes said it all. She meant to draw the enemy here, to face them where the old magic still lingered, to end the hunt, even if it meant ending herself. The sound of hooves reached them before the first riders came into view. Dozens of them, cutting through the desert in a single dark wave. Banners of dust rose behind them, glinting in the sunlight. At their head rode a man in black, his face hidden behind a mask of bone. His men fanned out across the plain, rifles glinting like teeth. Colt checked his revolver, the weight of it familiar and cold. He had fought impossible odds before, but this time he wasn't fighting for gold or freedom. He was fighting for her. The first bullet struck the old stone walls, sending shards flying. The air filled with gunfire and dust, with the scream of horses and the echoes of war. Colt moved like lightning, his shots sharp and deliberate, each one finding its mark. But there were too many. Ayana stood in the center of the courtyard, the wind tearing through her hair, her eyes closed. The mark on her shoulder flared once more, brilliant and terrible. The ground beneath her feet trembled. The ancient carvings glowed faintly, their light weaving upward in a slow, spiraling dance. The riders faltered. Their horses reared, terrified. The man in black shouted orders, but his voice was swallowed by the rising hum of the earth. Ayana lifted her hand, her face calm, and the desert itself seemed to answer her call. The sand erupted in a wave of fire and wind. A blinding storm swallowed the plain, tearing through the enemy ranks. Colt shielded his eyes, his breath catching in awe and terror. He could feel the power coursing through the air, alive, raw, uncontrollable. When the storm broke, silence fell. The riders were gone. The plain lay scorched and still. Only the wind moved, whispering through the ruins. Ayana stood alone in the aftermath, her body trembling, her face pale. The light of the mark had faded, leaving her weak and barely standing. Colt rushed to her side, catching her before she fell. Her heartbeat was faint, fragile as a candle flame. He carried her to the shadow of the crumbling mission wall, laying her gently down. Her eyes fluttered open, her lips parting slightly as she looked up at him. He didn't need to hear her words to understand what she meant. She had given everything. The curse of her bloodline, the secret of her power, to end what her people had begun. The desert stretched silent around them, as if holding its breath. Colt stayed with her until the sun dipped below the horizon. The light turned gold, then crimson, then faded to blue. Her breathing slowed with it, soft and steady, until at last it stopped. He buried her there among the ruins, marking the grave with the stone from the old altar. No words, no prayers, just the wind and the whisper of sand against the earth. Then he stood for a long time, staring out at the endless land, the place where she had fallen, the place where he had learned what love and loss truly meant. When the first stars appeared, Colt saddled his horse. His wound ached, his body heavy with exhaustion, but he didn't look back. He rode into the night, carrying with him the memory of the woman the desert had both cursed and blessed. Some said later that an outlaw had vanished into the dunes and was never seen again. Others claimed they saw him at the edge of the Rio Grande, still riding beneath a blood-red sky. But those who knew the land, those who still heard its stories whispered on the wind, believed something different. They said the outlaw and the guardian were never truly gone. They said that, when the storms rolled in and the thunder echoed across the plains, two shadows could be seen riding together through the dust. One of a man, one of a woman, bound forever by the desert that had taken everything and yet, somehow, given them each other.